of cloud and rain, which is that cold front I mentioned earlier. It's going to spread south and eastwards through tonight, bringing some heavier bursts, particularly across northwest Scotland, Northern Ireland and into northern England through tonight. Ahead of this, it'll be mostly dry but quite cloudy. But behind this, with a freshening breeze and some clearing spells, there might just be a touch of grass frost around to start Wednesday. Now, going through the rest of tomorrow, and this band of rain and cloud will make its way south and eastwards, clearing the far southeast around mid to late afternoon. So it could be quite cloudy for most of the day for East Anglia and southeast England. Though behind that cold front, there'll be plenty of sunny spells, though also quite a few blustery showers. So feeling colder behind the band of rain, though ahead of that, temperatures still remaining in the double figures for Wednesday. Looking through to the rest of the week, though, as I say, a colder end of the week to come with overnight frosts more likely, though not much in the way of rain and just a few sunny spells as well. Bye for now.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, "Nana, stop arguing." I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment.
I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News.
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Monday to Thursday on GB News, it's Bev Turner Today from 10 a.m. We're going to be here for you, our GB News family, to keep you up to date, but also make you smile.
There's a guy who went from puberty to adultery.
And I can't wait to bring a few of my own opinions.
I have no time for cultural totalitarianism.
We'll engage in passionate, but always polite debate, with your thoughts and opinions at the centre of it all. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
We are GB News, and we'd like to say thank you to each and every one of you for bringing us your conversations, for helping our great nation find its voice. We are here for you on radio, television, and online, across England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland.
It's not the BBC, you actually get your facts right.
We are proud to be GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. for Gloria Meets. In exclusive interviews, I'll be finding out who our politicians really are and what they really think.
It's something that you would never want anyone to suffer.
I didn't know what channels there were. I didn't think I'd be believed.
I must have weighed about 7 stone and I'm 5'8".
My instincts was to sort of cover this up. I mean, clearly that was a mistake.
Join me every Sunday at 6 p.m. on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
He's the king of breakfast TV, and he's back.
Eamon Holmes, back on the TV with me this morning.
Even remember my name.
I know, it's been 4 months. You have holy water by your bed?
Oh, yes. Already to bless.
Yeah. Oh, Eamon. Oh.
Why do you not believe anything I say?
Eamon Holmes back on GB News Breakfast at 6 a.m.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics, and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi, Andrew Pierce here. Join me every Friday lunchtime for a proper no-nonsense debrief of the week's events. With special guests in the studio and the GB News team on the ground, I'll be getting you up to date with news, some intelligent discussion, and my own sharp take. The weekend starts here with me every Friday lunchtime on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
It takes over a decade to build a wind farm offshore. It takes years to build nuclear power stations, years to build railways, reservoirs. And yet today the government was due to announce a way to speed that all up. Guess what? They've delayed that announcement. Irony is not dead. Today we're exploring the government's nationally important infrastructure projects plan, but also the potential for cabinet resignations over the new Brexit row. Stick around for that after the headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom. Here are the headlines. The Prime Minister's under pressure as speculation mounts over a possible deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Arriving for a meeting, Cabinet members were asked if they support Rishi Sunak. Following reports, ministers could resign if Northern Ireland's place in the Union is put at risk. The Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, and EU's Maros Sefcovic are due to hold in-person talks this week after what was described as a productive video discussion. Earlier, Under-Secretary of State for Women, Maria Caulfield, told us the Prime Minister is determined to resolve the issue.
Our priority is trying to get this right for the people of Northern Ireland. And, you know, the Prime Minister has met with the DUP, for example, who are happy with elements of it. And, you know, the work now is to try and get those negotiations to a place where we can get an agreement on this and can make progress.
Two former Prime Ministers are urging the government to send fighter jets to Ukraine. Liz Truss and Boris Johnson say air support is desperately needed to win the war, which began almost a year ago when Russia invaded the country. Last week, the Defence Secretary, Ben Wallace, suggested it could be years before the UK sends planes to Kyiv. The UK has reportedly spent more than £50 billion extra on gas since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The costs were analysed by advisory organisation Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. This after the International Monetary Fund said British households have been hit harder by the energy crisis than any other Western European country because of the UK's dependence on imported gas. 6 people have been killed in a 6.4 magnitude earthquake which struck the border region of Turkey and Syria. It's just 2 weeks after a larger quake near the same area killed more than 47,000 people and destroyed hundreds of thousands of homes. The country's government says more than 294 people are injured. Residents say more buildings have collapsed, but that most of the town had already fled after the initial earthquakes. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:34 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, the Prime Minister chairs Cabinet this morning amid increased speculation that some ministers might resign if his refreshed Brexit deal doesn't go far enough for the DUP, leaving too much EU control over the province of Northern Ireland. Yesterday, Home Secretary Suella Braverman became the second member of the Cabinet to warn that Rishi Sunak should not ditch the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, legislation that would allow Britain to unilaterally change the protocol in the event of an unsatisfactory deal. But let's talk to our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, now over these two dual rows. Darren's at Stormont for us this morning. Darren, there was a lot of excitement about a deal potentially being arrived at, and yet it's now gone a little bit more quiet.
Yeah, there was an expectation that actually we're going to see a deal announced either yesterday or indeed today. I think that is not now going to be the case. As you said, the Cabinet are meeting this morning. It'll be interesting to see whether it'll even be discussed at Cabinet. We normally get the readouts a little later on this morning. In addition to that, we know that Rishi Sunak spent most of yesterday afternoon actually in the Commons, in his office in Parliament, talking to MPs, trying to get those Brexiteers on side. But interestingly, Tommy, he doesn't just have to convince those Brexiteers, because he also needs to, in effect, convince the DUP, because the the Brexiteers, the ERG group, if you like, say that they cannot at this moment support any deal that does not have the support of the DUP. And at the moment, the DUP seem pretty lukewarm. They say, yes, progress has been made, but not enough to meet the aims that they want to see from these negotiations. And so we seem at the moment, at least from the outside, to be in a form of stalemate. Now, will the EU potentially budge a little bit further? Could Rishi Sunak ignore the DUP? Could he still cajole and convince those Brexiteers to back it? Or could we, as the Times seem to be suggesting this morning, be looking at a Prime Minister that could see cabinet resignations over this? Now, I think we're not at that stage yet, though there does seem to be agreement among some cabinet ministers that the Prime Minister shouldn't drop this Northern Ireland Protocol bill, the bill that was brought in, which could see Westminster override the Brexit agreement if they wanted to. So we don't know where the Prime Minister is on that, because it seems as part of the negotiations he seemed to be suggesting he could drop that if the deal was good for Northern Ireland. And all this while a minister was telling the Times this morning that people won't allow something that doesn't ensure sovereignty. Ministers will resign. I couldn't look myself in the eye and vote through something I thought would undermine sovereignty in Northern Ireland. However, you talk to people here in Belfast and they always say, well, that's precisely what happened in 2019, is possibly that minister, and certainly a lot of the Conservative Party did vote for a deal that undermined the sovereignty of Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, of course, remains inside the customs union and the single market, and so they may well take what's being said in Westminster today with a rather large pinch of salt, I would say, suggests Tom.
Talking about, of course, improvements upon the deal, and it would be odd, I would suggest, for someone to resign from Cabinet over a deal that was slightly better than the one that was agreed before, but not better enough in their view. Whatever deal is agreed in the coming days, weeks or months will surely be a slight, maybe a marginal, but a slight improvement, or maybe a large improvement, over the situation between East-West trade between Northern Ireland and Great Britain.
Yeah, indeed. Precisely the point I'm trying to make, in the sense that many of these ministers who are complaining, or indeed MPs are complaining about what this deal might look like, are the same ones that agreed to the deal in the first place. Of course, they signed up to it. They voted for it. They stood in the general election of 2019 saying it was a good deal. Now they think potential, as you say, an improvement on their deal will not be good enough. Now, we know the EU have shifted some ground. There was a recognition, not least of all from Leo Varadkar, the Irish Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, accepting that the deal that's currently in place isn't working terribly well, that they need to understand unionist concerns a lot more. But also, I think you need to add into this, Tom, as well, is the fact that there is no government here in Northern Ireland at the moment. Of course, Stormont has not been in session for the best part of a year. Teachers are on strike here in Northern Ireland, like they are in different parts of the UK. Many feel that their local politicians aren't just not listening to them, but cannot act because there is no devolved government. And that also weaves its way into the politics of this agreement as well.
Yes, plenty more to come on that, no doubt, as the days go on. But for now, Darren McCaffrey, thanks for joining us there live from Stormont. Now, just a reminder this morning that the Russian President Vladimir Putin is making a key state address in Moscow ahead of the one-year anniversary of Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. We can see him talking there in a key state address to many delegates and officials within the Russian Federation. We'll keep you abreast of what's going on there throughout the programme, and indeed talk a little bit more about the security of our part of the world in a later interview. But let's return to Westminster now, because the Deputy Political Editor of the Daily Mirror, Ben Glaze, joins me in the studio. And Ben, Rishi Sunak is hosting a cabinet meeting this morning, as he does most Tuesday mornings. What's top of the agenda?
They will be discussing, I'm sure, the ongoing situation with Brexit and whether or not there will be a deal to iron out the problems with the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now, this really goes to the heart of Rishi Sunak's early premiership, if you like, because he has sort of set his status along getting things done, you know, quietly beavering away, none of the sort of glamour that we might have associated with Boris Johnson, but sorting out problems. Now, we had expected there to be an announcement early this week, and we're already on Tuesday morning, and nothing's happened so far. Now, it could happen later today, it could happen tomorrow. I don't think that will happen because the DUP does seem to have thrown a spanner in the works. Remember, it's only got 8 MPs at Westminster. Yeah, because they are the voice of Northern Ireland, as they see it, certainly of unionism in Northern Ireland. They command a very strong voice, particularly as well with the ERG, the Conservative Party's hard right wing. One thing I think is interesting is when we're talking about potential government resignations, if the deal is seen to be not pure enough for some unionists, Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary, she was a senior figure in the ERG, the European Research Group. She's now the holder of one of the 4 great offices of state. Now, whether or not she gives her backing to this deal, and obviously as a cabinet member she would be expected to, that's key. And 2 other big figures in this, the Northern Ireland Secretary Chris Heaton-Harris and his deputy Steve Baker, former Brexit minister, they were both big voices in the ERG as well. So if they come on side, getting their support will be massive for Rishi Sunak in persuading the ERG and potentially the DUP to stay on board.
And it's fascinating because Suella Braverman and Steve Baker were so-called Brexit Spartans, those who voted against the deal 3 times. Now, Boris Johnson only voted against the deal twice. So potentially their influence here, what they say, and potentially Cabinet this morning might be discussing some of the details of what's in this deal, which I must stress, none of us have seen. We understand there might be a sort of a green lane for goods going from GB to NI, where they don't get checked so heavily if they're staying in Northern Ireland rather than going on beyond that. But we don't know the particular details, how deep that green lane is. Suella Braverman here might be a very, very key player.
Yeah, getting her on side, you'll be able to persuade the ERG, look, if even Suella backs it, it can't be that bad, can it? There was an interesting line in the Times this morning, a government official quoted as saying, when it comes to the DUP, we don't even need them to say yes, we just need them not to say no. So sort of quiet acquiescence from the DUP, and it's not something we associate with the Democratic Union, it has to be said, but that could be enough for this to get support.
Now, we're seeing on the other side of the House of Commons, the Labour Party is doing a bit of a policy push this week. Unusual, because this is a party that many people have been criticising for not really having any policies for the last few years. Today they're talking about farmers, but yesterday they were talking about drugs and antisocial behaviour. Is the Labour Party now trying to become the sort of hard-on crime, hard-on drugs party?
It's another example, I think, of Labour sort of trying to put its tanks on the traditional Tory lawns. They want to represent themselves as the party of law and order because people don't feel as safe in their communities as they did a few years ago. You remember the coalition government cut the number of frontline police officers by 21,000. Now, Boris Johnson, when he came in 2019, started replacing those numbers to 20,000, but he started bragging about, we've got 20,000 more officers on the beat. Well, no, you still got a net loss of 1,000. So what's Keir Starmer and the Shadow Home Secretary Yvette Cooper were saying yesterday when they were out in Grays in Essex on a visit, they were saying they'll put another 13,000 neighbourhood police officers and police community support officers on the beat. That's a very visible difference if they get into power and they're able to do that. People will see them out in their communities and they'll be focusing on antisocial behaviour and drug dealing in town centres. And of course, any crime expert will tell you that drug dealing fuels a lot of other crime because you've got acquisitive crime of people stealing to fund drug habits.
I think that there's a clear view across the country that sort of drug dealing is a very nefarious thing. And yet, across other issues with regard to drugs, social attitudes have changed a lot in the last 10 years. YouGov have brought out a couple of surveys now that show majority support for legalising cannabis in this country. Is the Labour Party at risk of sort of talking to a country that perhaps doesn't exist anymore, that perhaps has moved on some of these issues, as many European countries, American states, Canada and others move to legalise marijuana? Is the Labour Party potentially looking like it might be a bit out of step?
I don't think you certainly got to not to go and have a Labour Party saying they'll declassify or decriminalise cannabis. I remember covering courts back about 15 years ago, and it was moved from Class B to Class C before it was moved back up again. No, Labour wants to be seen as tough on crime, but you do have a situation. It's quite often you can walk down a street in London, particularly, you can just smell cannabis. in the air. It's effectively people turn a blind eye to it. You know, if you're probably caught for doing something else wrong in your search by the officers and they find cannabis on you, then you might get in trouble for it. But in and of itself, I suspect you're more likely to see an officer sort of take it off someone, stub it out and then walk off. It's not got the same sort of cachet as an offence that perhaps it used to. But, of course, some people say it's a gateway drug, and if you start taking cannabis, you could end up with ecstasy, cocaine and various other substances, which sort of lead to a life of crime.
Well, Ben Glaze, thank you so much for talking us through those big issues and, indeed, where the Labour Party stands on them. But back to government policy now, because building a new solar farm can take 4 years. It takes 13 years for an offshore wind farm to start generating any power. And from reservoirs to railways, our national infrastructure is slow, delayed and far more expensive than it needs to be. Since 2017, the proportion of nationally significant infrastructure projects taking more than 18 months to be approved, or indeed otherwise, has more than doubled. That's up from 20 to 43%, taking more than 18 months. And is it any wonder that when we look at the sort of bureaucracy involved, the average number of documents required for the approval process of infrastructure projects has soared from under 400 in 2012 to 1,100, over 1,100 today. Paperwork that's stopping us from building things. And this is particularly stark when it comes to nuclear power. Hinkley Point C required 1,000 planning documents. Now, the later, almost identically sized Sizewell C project has taken almost 4,500 documents. This, of course, creates delays and increased costs. Now, the Levelling Up and Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, was due to publish the Nationally Significant Infrastructure Projects Reform Action Plan. Bit of a mouthful today. A plan to speed up our agonisingly slow delivery of projects like big power developments, transport links, and indeed other major schemes. Although almost poetically, this morning I've learned that the government's plan to speed things up has itself now been delayed. What a metaphor. The government will publish the action plan on Thursday, rather than today, as had been originally planned. Let's hope it really does and it's not delayed any further. But let's speak now to Freddie Poser, the director of the affordable housing campaign Priced Out, who joins me in the studio. And Freddie, should we be surprised that it's taking this long? There was a consultation about speeding up infrastructure 2 years ago, and we're still not seeing the results of it.
Well, it's clearly a really thorny issue that the government is trying to grapple with. And part of the issue is that the delays come from so many quarters. If you pointed out that the massive increase in documents between the two nuclear power reactors there, that doesn't just come from one piece of legislation or one group. It's all these extra things that have been layered into the process. One of the big ones is environmental impact assessments. So the environmental impact assessment for the former reactor was 30,000 pages long. The next one was over 40,000 pages long. So these documents are getting longer.
And this is just checking if any newts happen to live nearby or whatever else.
It's a really comprehensive review of this stuff that could be streamlined. So the government is clearly having to look at a lot of stuff, but they've been talking about this for years now. In fact, nationally significant infrastructure projects, that was the scheme that was meant to speed this all up. It's much better than the previous scheme, where it took 8 years to approve Terminal 5 at Heathrow, for example. So this scheme was meant to be the panacea, the thing that solved this problem.
But it's got bogged up over time.
And it's slowed down since it came in 2012, yes.
So that's a really interesting point, because we're looking at all of these different infrastructure projects across the country, whether it's trying to build extra housing, whether it's trying to build a railway, whether it's trying to build a reservoir in the southeast of England, which we haven't done since the 1970s. Then we wonder about droughts. This is a real particular problem for the United Kingdom. We just aren't very good at building things anymore.
Yeah, and it seems like the main issue is not just we're not good at building stuff, we don't even let the building happen in the first place. In fact, when we do build stuff, it can be very impressive. Crossrail, for example, had its flaws, but certainly is an impressive and well-built railway. We need to get on and build this stuff, though, and what the government is planning to do, or at least has made noises that they are planning to do, and we don't know what they're going to do because, as you've pointed out, it's been delayed again. But what they've been talking about for years is making a shorter application process. So these nationally significant infrastructure projects are decided by the Secretary of State, not by local councils. And the idea is there's already meant to be a maximum length of time that these projects can take to be approved, which is, as you said, delayed by 43% of cases. They want to make a faster version of that for some projects. And it's a no-brainer for many. So, for example, energy projects, we desperately need new energy. And if that energy is green, say offshore wind or new nuclear, we should be able to take steps to say, well, this is obviously going to help the environment. We don't need to do 40,000 pages of environmental impact assessment to know that building green power is good for people's energy bills and good for the environment.
It's interesting. The campaign group Britain Remade has recently been looking at what's been going on in the European Union. And a lot of Brexiteers might raise an eyebrow here because the European Union seems to be deregulating faster than the United Kingdom in this space. Spain has created a fast track for sort of green infrastructure that don't have to do these environmental impact assessments. And the EU Commission is looking... Is the UK at risk of looking sort of more EU when it comes to red tape than the EU does now?
I think potentially a lot of this regulation comes originally from the EU, and now, you know, we're stuck in this world where we should be able to really change it. And maybe, you know, if you're a Brexiteer, you could see some of this as a Brexit freedom that we could move on ourselves. But I think it's really tough with so much up in the air with Brexit, the Northern Ireland Protocol, for example, that these things aren't being done. So I hope that on Thursday we see a really comprehensive plan that's going to tackle some of the issues. As you point out, Britain Remade has been really good on this stuff, pointing out, you know, where the government could really move and make a difference.
Well, let's hope that they have been listening to some of these complaints and indeed that it is not delayed yet again. Freddie Poser, thank you so much for joining us and talking through that big issue. But finally today, President Biden is in Eastern Europe, meeting with countries feeling threatened by Russia. Friday, of course, marks the one-year anniversary of Putin's brutal full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And ahead of that solemn anniversary, Russian President Vladimir Putin is making his key state address in Moscow. He's blamed the West for provoking the war and escalating it, saying the US and its allies seek limitless power. It comes after the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has said in recent days that China may be on the brink of supplying arms to Russia. And, of course, Russia has been using Iranian dive-bombing drones, hitting civilian targets across Ukraine. It's an uncertain world, and countries like Russia, China and Iran are becoming increasingly belligerent. Well, let's discuss this new potential axis of evil with Behnam Ben Talblou, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies, who joins me now. Thank you for making the time this morning. I'm interested in this sort of cooperation that we're seeing, particularly between Russia and Iran, supplying these drones that have been attacking clearly civilian targets. They seem to be getting away with this.
Indeed, and it's a pleasure to be with you. On the one-year anniversary of the Ukraine war, which is coming up in just a few days, who would have known that the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism, the Islamic Republic of Iran, would have been able to team up with a country that it has 500 years of enmity with, which is Russia, whether it's Tsarist, Soviet Union, or present form. So there is a lot of conventional wisdom busting that needs to happen in London and in Washington about the nature of this evolving relationship, as you rightly say, which is a new axis of evil. And it's not just Iran and Russia drawing closer together to, you know, work to basically undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and, in effect, the liberal world order. It's other states as well, such as China, which may be considering way in even more, but also North Korea, another nuclear-armed rogue state, has given the Russians artillery for use in this conflict as well.
It's fascinating because only on last Friday there was a conference in Tokyo, attended by many parliamentarians around the world, this international interparliamentary group on China. The former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Liz Truss, promoted the idea of forming a sort of economic NATO with G7 countries, with Australia, with others, to sort of try and band together the free democracies of the world against, potentially, those autocracies. Is that an idea that has legs?
It's an idea which certainly should have legs, and perhaps one of the shortcomings of the Western Bloc, or this kind of defenders of what's left of the liberal world order is that they haven't thought of it soon enough. The Chinese have been able to have their cake and eat it too, to exploit this system while engaging in predatory, economic practices. So it's high time the West has not just an economic policy, has not just a foreign policy, but has a foreign economic policy that is in concert, not conflict with its strategies and values. And doing that, I think, would be basically the price floor to such a shift.
And how should these countries work in concert? Obviously, it's an incredibly interconnected world. We've just spoken about how China, Iran, Russia, North Korea, these countries may well be working more closely together. Does that mean that the free democracies of the world need to work more closely together? What sort of steps should we be taking?
Well, certainly it means understanding the capacity and capability that every single state can provide, whether that's economic, whether that's industrial, whether that's manufacturing, playing to the comparative advantage of each state and playing to what the population within each state can do, so you don't have some sort of a backlash, whether from the far left or far right in any of these constituencies, in what you rightly call a Western or a free bloc.
Now, your specialism here is Iran, and obviously we've seen enormous tumult within that country in recent months. Protests, indeed threatened executions. What is the state of play here? Are we potentially on the brink of some internal change within that country?
Well, the protests that have been going on, and quite bravely for 5+ months now, inside the Islamic Republic are qualitatively different from what, people may have seen on television in 1999 or in 2009. These really, their point of origin is December 2017, where a wider geographic and demographic scale of protests have been happening across Iran. And make no mistake, this is not a quest for reform. All of those different iterations of protests, which have an economic spark, a social spark, and even environmental spark, is a sign that the society is fed up with the state. And this is really a quest for a revolution against the Islamic Republic of Iran. You fundamentally have a leadership that is Islamist presiding over a population which is nationalist. And that cocktail simply cannot hold. And that explains why we've seen this boom and bust cycle. And also, because the government has not given an inch, explains why you've seen really so much carnage by the state against the society. They've weaponized their what we call injustice system. There's stories of rapes, and beyond unjust detention, there's rapes and killings inside of these jails. So most unfortunately, this kind of barbarism is set to continue.
Well, we'll be keeping a keen eye on what develops there. Indeed, it's a very bleak situation. But Behnam Talbu, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies, thank you so much for joining us this morning. That's it for the show today. Coming up, it's Bev Turner Today.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton. I'll bring you the sharpest takes and hottest debates.
Do you not believe in prison? I don't believe in prison.
I'm completely stunned. I guarantee you there'll be no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I actually was personally quite offended by it.
And no reason to go to bed.
So I guess they've always been quite woke.
That's Dan Wootton tonight on TV, radio and online. Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. on GB News. The People's Channel, Britain's